So now let's dissect PESTE and run through what each of these stands for and just some examples of what to look at. So first we're going to start with P, political forces. This is any kind of policies, laws, regulations that impact us as an industry. And sometimes things are passed and they're not passed specifically because of the hospitality industry, but they still impact us. So an example of this is the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the company Enron. In fact, Minute Maid Field, I believe it was, used to be called Enron. One of our stadiums used to be called Enron. I believe it was Minute Maid Field. And Enron was this huge entity in Houston. It was a really big deal. And when Enron was found to be cooking the books, they were doing some things with their accounting to make it look like they were being more profitable than they were. The shareholders ended up having to pay for that. It was this really big scandal. A lot of people got into really bad financial situations. It really impacted all the employees. It was this huge blowout. I really recommend that you look up Enron. It's a huge part of our history within the last, couple of decades. It's really important to understand that. I'm not going to get into too much more detail, but after all this blew up and all these problems occurred because of Enron, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act was actually passed. And what this act determines is that every publicly owned company, anything that's in the stock market, has to release an annual report that shows, truthfully, what financially is going on within that company. And so the reason now that all these publicly traded companies are publishing their annual reports with all their financial information is because it's now a law that requires them to. So it's a law that was passed based on Enron, which is an oil and gas company that impacts us in the hospitality industry because we too have to abide by this law. So sometimes things that seemingly don't impact us have a really huge role in the outcome of what we have to do. Other things that are passed that are not necessarily just geared to us might be new laws with minimum wage. It might be new overtime laws that are coming out. A lot of people are talking about how they want to make stricter overtime laws to protect employees. Maybe you have the new Healthcare Act and your requirements as far as ensuring healthcare for your employees might change the way you run your business. And even something like licensing and liquor laws might impact it, or health organizations. So we have a lot of different political forces going on. When you see political, don't necessarily think of political party or politician. Think of political in the sense of anything dealing with the government or regulation or laws. Next, we look at the first E, which is economic factors. These are things going on in the economy that are going to impact us. In general, we tend to have luxury items. We are selling leisure and luxury things. Things like going out for a nice meal or going on a vacation. Things that are first to be cut off typically, you'd have to prove this with actual documentation, but things that we typically cut off first before we'd say stop paying for our rent or stop paying our car payment. And so based on the economy, it's going to impact whether or not we have a large demand or how we're doing. When things started getting economically downturn in the mid-2000s, like 2007, 8, 9, some of the big convention cities were hit hard because instead of having big extravagant conventions in Las Vegas and Orlando, instead these conventions were going more locally where they could really focus on business and not spend as much money taking their team to this location or having the convention in this location. And so different economic factors will play a role. Another one might be I think it was in 2012, Greece had a huge economic crisis. The value of their currency was significantly deflated, even though it was part of the euro. And a lot of people went into bankruptcy. There was a lot of political turmoil because of this, and a lot of social turmoil because of this. And tourism and travel to Greece stifled off significantly based on these economic crises. So it's really important to watch. What will also happen is as a dollar valuation goes down in a certain country, tourism tends to go up because people from other countries will want to come. So as the euro is stronger and the US dollar is weaker, more Europeans will travel to the US in the time when their money will get them further. But if the euro goes down in value and the dollar goes up, you might find the alternate, that US citizens will travel to Europe because their dollar now gets them further than they used to go. And so you're constantly seeing shifts and changes in dollar valuations that will shift and change the markets, and they're willing to come. Right now, Brazil is going through some economic hard times as well as some other things, and you're finding many fewer Brazilian tourists in the States, which are hurting places like Orlando, where they see large Brazilian tour groups during the summer. They're just not seeing that same demand at this point in time because of the economic situation in that country. And those are the foreign currency and exchange rates. So next, let's look at sociocultural. So I'm only going to bring in generational information simply because your book does, and it's kind of a hot topic, although that's going away. And I'm going to bring in a different perspective because I actually did my master's research on generational differences and looking at what Generation Y wanted and understanding what made Generation Y different from other market segments. And the results were actually a little bit surprising based on all the press that the generational information has been getting. And so when you're looking at the changing demographics of your customers, you can look at different nationalities coming in. You might have an influx of different groups of peoples from different ethnicities, different languages, different religious groups that will play an impact or role in the way you maybe want to run your business or which market segment you're really gearing towards. And then, of course, socioculture has a big part to do with social opinion or public opinion and how that impacts how happy people are with the product you're offering, and I have some examples of that. So first, let's look at generations. So the first thing I want to show is that generations break down differently based on your source. So these are just general generational differences, and these are averages from all the different sources I looked at. I looked at quite a few different sources, and this is based in America only. So this isn't even generational differences in other countries. In other countries, they're going to have different breakdowns and they're going to have different cultural norms and suggestions based on that country because each country has a different culture. And we'll get into actually corporate culture next chapter 4, not chapter 3, in chapter 4, and we'll look at how culture is a really important factor. And so I'm not going to get too much into the greatest generation. They're your grandparents, your great-grandparents, the ones who lived through the Great Depression, World War II. And we're going to skip straight to baby boomers. So the big thing going on right now in the media, what you'll find is baby boomers versus millennials. And I want to show you that actually baby boomers, after them comes Gen X, then Gen Y, and then millennials. And oftentimes people interchange Generation Y and millennials when they shouldn't be, because it's actually a very large span. Millennials are people who are born around the millennium. It's a new transition. And so someone who's born in the 70s is highly unlikely to be similar as someone who was born in the late 90s. And so there's actually another break in the generation. So already there's some complications and differences, and there's this warring, butting heads of baby boomers and millennials that I think maybe we need to take a different perspective on. So let's take a look at that. When I did research on Generation Y, because that's the research I didn't do it on millennials, I did on Generation Y. What we were finding is that Generation Y tended to be highly political. This doesn't mean that they were involved in Democrat versus Republican or all this. You see a lot of things about how they're against big government. Political simply means they're involved. They talk about government. I'm sure you have friends who are talking about this new election coming up and they're voicing their opinion. That's something new. With the advent of social media, we've had more of a voice than past generations have had, and so you're seeing that influx. They tend to want to have purpose for what they do. They don't want to just go do their job, come home, and whatever they were told to do in their job, they did because that was their job and they were just making a paycheck and coming home. Instead, what you're finding is that Generation Y wants to have a purpose for what they're doing. They want to have an impact. They want to know that they're making good social changes around them and that there's something positive in what they do. They need to have an explanation of why they do what they do. And so this really changes the dynamics of a workplace because now you need to explain how things are impacting them. And the same for our customers. We have to explain to them why they should come to our company and what the benefit is and how they're advancing not only themselves but others around them. Most of the feedback you get about Generation Y, they talk about negatively. They say, oh, they're the most praised generation, they got participation badges, they were told they were special. And what's interesting about that is the baby boomer generation is the one who told Generation Y all those things, but I also think at the end of the day, it's all how you spin it. So yes, you could spin it negatively that they tend to want to be acknowledged for the things that they've accomplished and not just do it without getting acknowledged. But that can also be a really good thing because then there's an open line of communication between management and employees and between an organization and customers because they can have that open communication. They're used to being told, oh, well, this was done really well and maybe this wasn't, and this is how we can improve. And so there's that open line of improving things. It's all how you look at it and how you treat it and how you react to it. Also, you're seeing increased access to technology, which increases their ability to look for options and just changes the dynamics of the marketplace. I'll look at a little bit more of that in the technology section. And then also you're finding a more global labor pool, that things are becoming more diverse, which is a really great thing because it brings people together in a new and different way. So in your book, they really talk about how Generation Y is kind of negative. You can get the feel of how old the people in the book are who wrote this because they tend to be, bad Generation Y, good baby boomers. But I find that neither generation is bad nor good, simply different preferences based on a very wide selection of people. And also keep in mind, this is 75 million people we're talking about in one generation. And so obviously you're going to have many individual differences, and this is just generic. So some other social cultural things to look at is public opinion. And so for example, you can look at minimum wage laws, and I have two videos here about minimum wage. One is for and one is against, so you can kind of compare those two videos. The one I think is even more telling is SeaWorld. So a couple of years ago, there was a documentary that came out sponsored by PETA, called Blackfish. And you can imagine PETA and what their stance on SeaWorld was. If you know anything about this organization, they tend to be against, they're for animal rights and against anything that holds any animals in captivity. That includes zoos, obviously water parks, other things. And so they made this video, and I won't give my opinion on the video, but basically stating how bad SeaWorld is and about how these poor animals are being treated. And then when this movie came out, they used the death of a trainer from an orca who died from the orca she was training, and they used her as an excuse or a reason that there should be no more SeaWorld. And then of course her family came out and they were very angry at them using her name because she wouldn't have felt that way. She was very supportive of SeaWorld, even knowing how dangerous the job was. So you have videos there. There's a link to a trailer for Blackfish, so you can see what that was about. And there's also the news story from Dawn's family that reacted to this video that came out using their daughter's name. And then the most interesting part of this is because of social opinion, whether or not people agreed with this documentary, true or not, however you want to look at it, that the earnings of SeaWorld have decreased drastically, and SeaWorld is in dire straits at this point. And the reason for this is not just because a documentary came out, it's because they didn't have any marketing or PR to handle the crisis when it happened. So this was a huge crisis, and they tried to just ignore and sweep it under the rug, thinking it would be nothing and no big deal. And in fact, it was quite the opposite. It had a very huge impact, and they didn't react for way too long. And now perhaps it's too late for SeaWorld to recover, and perhaps not. They do have a new CEO. The CEO was requested to step down after about a year and a half of not being able to successfully handle the crisis that happened. And this is all based on public opinion that impacted the amount of people who wanted to go to the park. Then you're going to see other things like movements or social changes. Maybe they're dietary things. We're seeing a lot more gluten-free now. We're seeing a lot more vegan and vegetarian options at restaurants. So we're starting to see shifts in menus. Maybe they're more health conscious now. You now have listed the amount of calories that are in a meal. Maybe you have a menu that's specifically for health conscious people. Those are social changes, social cultural changes in the market that impact us as long as we ride the waves of these social changes. Another really fun one here is sci-fi and anime conventions. They're becoming huge. They're all over the place. Almost every major city now has one. People dress up. They have a lot of fun. It's very enjoyable. And they dress in all sorts of things. They dress from their favorite movies, their favorite animated classics, TV shows, video games. Anything you can think of, they probably dress in some way. And these are really huge. One of the biggest is Dragon Con, and I believe that means in Atlanta. And there's a fun video here, YouTube, one called Dragon Con. I recommend watching it because it's just really interesting. It just shows all the different kinds of costumes people bring in. There are actually all these rules and there are regulations. There are people who are professional anime goer or convention goers, and they go to these different conventions. and they're paid to go there, and they look like a lot of fun. I haven't been to one, but I find them very interesting. Well, a couple years ago, a new convention was supposed to be the very first anime and sci-fi convention was supposed to be held in Chicago at, I believe it was a Westin. Well, the people at the Westin didn't understand this new social change that was coming, or this new group that was coming in, and they at one point said, "These freaks are coming." Well, that's not a very nice thing to tell someone, and they weren't culturally aware of this new phenomenon that was coming in, or this phenomenon that's been around for a while, but it's gaining popularity. And they actually ended up losing that business, and the convention was moved to another location. The next year, they didn't even have it that year. So really big deal. Even one word said by one person can have a huge impact on social cultural changes within the marketplace. All right. Next, let's move on to technology. Technology is huge, so I'm just going to highlight a couple of different examples. So technology, there's two different ways to approach this. One is the consumer perspective and how they interact with technology, and then one is the organization. As a consumer, we have more options. We can look online, we can compare rates like in ways that we never have been able to before. And so this is changing or adapting the way that we have to sell our product based on all these different mediums online. Okay, they can even share information, go online and get reviews. The power of word of mouth has increased significantly based on this. And then we also have to be careful of cyber technology and cyber terrorism and make sure we're protecting our guests or our customers. And you'll see in this article here, White Lodging had a data breach of their credit cards, and quite a few different people were impacted by this cyber terrorism that happened, and we have to make sure that we're diligent and reacting to it as quickly as possible. The more interesting side of this is how we as an organization use technology and how we can improve our operations. We can have better hiring process by doing background checks in a way we couldn't do before. We can actually look online through different database and systems. We can make sure we're hiring people who are legal to work here rather than illegal aliens who we might then be in contest with the government, and if they were to find out, then we could lose our ability to run our business, which did happen at different points in time for different companies. And then also we can have high-tech solutions to different areas of the organization business. So a really fun one came out a couple years ago is the Magic Band at Disney World. And the way the Magic Band works is it works like a room key. It also is a purchasing device, and it is also your park entrance. And so by using this one band, and FastPass, which is a front-of-the-line technology, by using this Magic Band, they have your name, and they are able to get you access to all the things you need without having to carry a wallet or money or anything else. And you don't even have to go to the front desk anymore. They can text you your room number, and you go directly to your room and get in access with your Magic Band, which they send you at home before you even arrive. And so if you want to look a little bit more at the Magic Bands, you can see a video there. Some other examples are RFID technology. This is huge, radio frequency. And what this does is it helps track different equipment. It helps us track inventory. We can make sure that we are not using too much or have too much waste. And it can help with keyless entry. So those Magic Bands use an RFID technology to get into the rooms. And so if you want to know more about RFID, which I really recommend that you do, there are two very short explanation videos that help explain what RFID are. There is a commercial about how potentially RFID technology can be used in the future, and then there's also a news story about maybe some unease with RFID technology, maybe some downfalls to this. Again, you need to be really aware of social opinion. Whether or not it's realistic, it doesn't matter, as if that's what people believe, then it's something we need to be aware of. Another example of this is the keyless room entry, maybe even using your cell phone. So instead of even having a Magic Band or a key of any sort, you could go straight to your room because someone texted you your room number, and then you'd have access through your cell phone technology. Really interesting. The original article I found on this is that top link. For some reason, that link isn't working, so I found another article, and you can look up this idea, and you can find article after article after article of different companies that are looking at cell phones as a way to enter into hotel rooms. And then a really interesting one, I'm not sure how I feel about this, is actually using biometric scanning, whether that's through the eyes or through your fingerprints. So you wouldn't need anything but your own body, and you would be able to purchase things, get into your room, anything else. The problem with that, again, looking back at that cybersecurity, if you lose your credit card number, if someone steals that, yeah, that sucks and is something you have to deal with, but it's on a whole nother level when they take your biometric scan. So different opinions, different folks. You can read the article there. It's a very interesting case. And then last but not least for PEST is ecological forces. These are the environmental things that are going to impact our choices and decision making. It could be LEED certification of architecture and building. It can be green initiatives we take of not washing the sheets and towels every day that a guest is staying with us. Maybe we get certifications from different NGO groups. There are quite a few that use that. Maybe we choose to use cleaners that are more environmentally friendly. These decisions and choices we make are based on ecological, has a social cultural aspect to it, an environmental aspect to it, an economic aspect to it, as well as a political. So this kind of puts everything in together. An interesting example is that you can do hotel soap recycling now. There are a number of different companies that do this, where you pay a small fee because it is an NGO, and you send your partially used products from the bathroom, soaps, shampoos, conditioner, all those little mini bottles that aren't fully used. You would actually send those to this company and they clean the product and they're able to repackage it and then send it to countries that don't have the access to maybe the same hygienic policies that we do, or maybe they just don't have the money to purchase this for maybe schools or other lower income areas. And so you can see some pictures down at the bottom here of some of those soap processing plants, and they also take in all those little plastic bottles and recycle those. So some cool things. PEST has a huge impact on our organization. Even things that we might not even think they do, they will. So this is going to be a major part of your assignment for this chapter.